This is Dateline News and Conversation. Tonight, we're continuing the discussion, the economics of war and peace, and we're talking about a radical new way to do taxes. Not necessarily on the rich, not necessarily on the rest of us, but on the commons. My guest, you'll remember, you know her, Alanna Hartzok. She's been working at this for a number of years. So, Alanna, I want to welcome you back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Regis. I so much appreciate being with you and being able to present this information. We're seeing this one now as, I believe, fifth in the series, and the fifth and final as a formal presentation of the series. And so I'm going to start the share screen and then the PowerPoint. See if it comes up here. And then get that ready from the beginning. Let me know when you see the first slide that's going to work for us here.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. So economics of war and peace. Now, the tax shift to what we call the commons rent, that unearned income that really accrues to the gifts of nature, the gifts of the earth, the commons. And here we go. We've seen this one before. This is a slide of one of my very favorite old photographs, Chief Little Bear at a World Expo, pointing at the crack in the Liberty Bell, this imperfect bell that couldn't even stay durable so that it ring well. Well, this is a metaphor we're using for the problem of democracy. It is incomplete. It did not give us the economic rights. It did not give us primarily the fundamental economic right to our earth, to our planet. So we want to have a democracy that works for everybody. And we'll go through the slides we've been using this series of the essentials of economic rent and a war economy. So this just shows a just and harmonious society. People have access to the earth. They use land and resources to build what they need, their shelter, everything, their food, and it's an unobstructed flow. That is just the way indigenous cultures and people used to live. They had access to nature. Now, the second one, there is a privilege fund that's growing. We see two guns, 2 points of violence. When people have to pay rent for access to land, exploitation of their labor begins. Because of this rent leak, people can't get the capital, the tools they need without borrowing from this privilege fund lending system and paying interest. So you see the first point of violence is the shutoff of access of human beings to the commons, to the land, to the earth, where others have gained control through force, and they then charge others. The majority are charged for access to the basics, to the land, to the earth. And then if you can't afford land from your wages, you might say your slave wages, you can't build a house without money and land. You have to borrow money. So how we have now the major mortgage payments go to housing, and this whole system keeps increasing, more and more homelessness and lack of affordable housing. And then eventually the few who then capture the commons rent, they privatize the land and resource value. Privilege means private law, and they establish the banking systems, usury, interest rates for banking. So through the land rent that's privatized and the interest, we have growing super rich, super wealthy. We have a power elite that then want to extend and further their power. And so they managed to get hold of a lot of the people's money, the public finance, the tax dollars, to expand in wars. They invest in land and resources around the world, If the people in other countries begin to rebel, they want to uh, nationalize or socialize their very own land and resource base, then the imperialist system sends in the military. And we all know that is at its height in our world right now. To quell these protests, investors call for military intervention. I've mentioned before Frank Dorell's excellent compilation documentary on what I learned about U.S. foreign policy. It shows 10 or 12 examples of the land and money power elite controlling the military. When you see leaders emerge like Lumumba and others in Africa who want to nationalize their own people's resources, then we send in the military. This happened recently. We can see it with what happened to Venezuela and Trump's statements about our oil, as if our oil is somehow in Venezuela. So now this last in our series, we're going to really look at what I call often Earth rights democracy. It is a new role, a new mandate for governance for democracy, and that is primarily to make sure that this privately collected value of the earth's land and resources is directly used for the benefit of the people, is returned for the people. And the new institution, then local to global, is to have resource rent funds. That's what we're going to be going through in this series of slides. How to collect the resource rents and channel it back to the people. We live in a complicated, complex economy. We can't talk about everybody getting an equal amount of land. We live in cities. We have complexities. So this mediation of the resource rent fund, since we do give monetary value to land resources, is really a key to how we have a fair economy, address wealth inequality, and build an economics of peace. So you'll notice in this diagram, there are no guns because we're addressing the land and the money problem, the primary points of exploitation and violence. So the privilege fund is equitably returned to society by the public collection of the land and resource rents. Workers with their just economic opportunities restored can now accumulate capital through their own savings, which would mean a way more small businesses, family-owned businesses, and cooperative ownership of capital. And so we have economic justice with abundance and peace restored. So the money problem, debt, the Jubilee. Henry George, and that's the one who brought forward much of what we've been presenting in this series, the Henry George political economy of land, labor, and capital, distorted and obfuscated. We've covered this previously when land, the factor for the whole earth itself, all the gifts of nature, was made a subset of capital. And that's our neoliberal economics system that cannot solve the war and the wealth inequality problem. So we've been going through Henry George, how he rediscovered these basic perennial wisdom teachings. But in his very last book, The Science of Political Economy, he advocated for abolishing laws enforcing private debt collection, viewing it as a way to foster higher moral character and commerce and reduce the burden on courts and create a more stable economy by limiting speculative credit and promoting business based on genuine standing rather than debt. I mean, now super wealthy and investment funds, they borrow money in order to buy land. And now they have more land to collect more of the land rent. And that's really what they're after. So we want to eliminate that entire land and money debt system. So Henry George believed that this debt jubilee would relieve society from crippling obligations, leading to greater economic soundness, similar to historical clean slate traditions. that prevented mass impoverishment. Now, these go back thousands of years when debts were recorded on clay tablets when a new sovereign came in, a new king came to power. All of this debt recorded on the clay tablets, they were broken apart and destroyed. We also have biblically in Leviticus, every 7 years, the silver jubilee, all debts were to be canceled, as how the new promised land was to be lived in. So with periodic debt cancellation jubilees, and then 7 times 7 plus 1, which is 50 years, you had a money debt jubilee, plus you had the right of return to land bases that were justly established. So beyond this private debt issue, of course, we have public debt. And Henry George also supported the idea of periodic debt cancellation here. He echoed ideas from figures like Thomas Jefferson to prevent future generations from being burdened by past financial obligations, which he saw as destabilizing for nations. And of course, the United States and elsewhere, we have massive public debt that more and more of the percentage of our tax dollars are paid to those who owe the debt money, the few who we owe the debt money to, and this gets passed on as a burden to our children and our grandchildren. So in essence, George saw debt cancellation not as a handout, but as a structural reform to create a healthier, more ethical, less crisis prone economic system, ultimately aligning with the broader philosophy of land value taxation to address societal inequality. Key arguments for the debt cancellation, a jubilee justice, moral improvement by removing legal compulsion for debt repayment. Credit would become based on character and trustworthiness, improving commercial ethics for production of real goods and services. Economic stability, reducing reliance on credit, would temper the speculative booms and busts, creating a more stable financial environment. Judicial relief, free courts from handling a vast number of debt-related cases, allowing them to focus on more important functions. Historical precedent, Henry George saw parallels in ancient traditions of debt cancellation that restored economic balance, prevented perpetual debt servitude, as discussed in his writings by modern scholars. It got so bad in Europe and the British areas, people so much in debt, they were put in debtors' prisons. And for instance, Australia was settled in the beginning by people who were taken out of these debtors' prisons and sent to Australia was a debtors' colony. When I was there giving an Earthrights Democracy lecture series a few years ago, I went to one of these locations with the building still standing, where these previous debtors had been imported to Australia, and there was a plaque on the wall. I remember it was a woman's name. It said she'd been living there because she had been in a prison in Britain because she had been stealing bread for her starving children. Now we have a beautiful new movement called the public banking movement I want to tell you about because I think it fits very, very well with solving the land problem. Not-for-profit banks with, excuse me, a depository bank charter that the public owns through the representative government and that work to benefit local communities. Public finance funds, the taxes, are deposited in the public bank until dispersed, and then loans can be given for public needs. So we're talking about low interest funds for public betterment. So note this website, publicbankinginstitute.org. Public banking is banking operated in the public interest through institutions owned by the people through their representative governments, whether it's local to global. They exist at all levels, cities to state to national, Any governmental body that can meet local banking requirements may, theoretically, create such a financial institution. So this is organized movement throughout the United States and a number of other countries as well. And in that website, you will see details about our state public bank of North Dakota. Very important to look at how it actually works in practice, and also other countries that have public banking institutions and how they work. So this is a bold claim here. We can build a system of public finance that will strengthen and maximize incentives for fair distribution of wealth, environmental protection, efficient wealth production, provision of adequate government services, and peaceful resolution of territorial conflicts. Those are five birds hatching out of one egg, which is a fundamentally important tax shift. And we had a session also in this series on Henry George and Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist and philosopher Leo Tolstoy, who said solving the land problem is the solving of all social problems. A bold claim, but he totally understands what we'll be presenting next and how this works. So if it's a social problem, when the land problem is addressed, we're going to help solve it here. How? By sharing this commons rent, which is estimated to be about 1/3 of economic production, or as measured by GDP. 1/3 is the commons rent, which is now majorly privately owned and captured. So this unearned income, which is what Adam Smith called it, or surplus value, which Karl Marx called it. Now, these two seeming polarity actually agree on fundamentals about the land problem and how to solve it. That would make another interesting presentation at some point. But they agree that that is the profit from the gifts of nature, should be socialized, should be shared by the community, by the people as a whole. Biblically, Ecclesiastics statement, the profit of the earth is for all. So where are we going to pull this unearned income, this surplus value? Surface land sites based on the land value. So our surface land, which goes up in value faster than the return to wages. The law of rent we've covered previously, driving wealth inequality, driving the increasing lack of housing affordability. So there's unearned income, massive amounts, of course, in ownership of control of oil and minerals, of the gift of nature of water, of land used for farmland, timber, and grazing land, of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is now largely given away to a few media corporations. We should be charging rent for access to the commons of the spectrum. And these geo-orbital zones is getting to be high real estate value there in the L4 and L5 zones, where satellites balance in the gravity between the Earth and the Moon. Commons rent public finance removes, it's important, this is not any kind of increase in the tax burden. This is always a shift from the good things we want that we shouldn't be taxing to the unearned income of the commons rent. So we want to shift taxes away from wages and other earned income. If it's productive, sustainable capital, creating needed goods and services, that's a good. We want to have things that we need. So we don't want to tax that. We want to remove that tax. Sales, especially for basic necessities, sales taxes on food, that's absurd. We want to remove most of the sales taxes And certainly we want to remove taxes from our houses, from our homes. We don't want to have an increased tax when we fix up our house and other buildings. That's produced wealth. It takes wages, it takes work to build houses. Don't tax the things that we need. Subsidies are a huge issue in the United States, certainly. There's massive subsidies going for corporations, the big ones that have the energy production, resource extraction, commerce and industry, agriculture and forestry. The large agribusiness corporations are getting subsidies to not grow the food that we need. The smaller farms do not receive those subsidies. Smaller businesses are not getting these subsidies. We want to get rid of these very unfair subsidies. If we want to talk about a market, we shouldn't be talking about people's tax dollars subsidizing the big owners and controllers that fundamentally rule the monopolized market economy. And so this last important one, the weapons of mass destruction, we're looking at budget proposals of $1.5 trillion. This building of a military industrial complex, we, off the backs of the people's work and labor, are paying for these horrific wars. And we're talking here of how we're funding the military industrial complex, which many are aware. Our earlier president, Dwight David Eisenhower, his last speech warned against the military industrial complex. This is a big, big shift we're going to have to make to build an economy of peace and the right to direct our people's tax dollars where we want it to be spent. And just another point on this issue, foreign policy, weapons of mass destruction. We, the people, have not been included in our foreign policy decision making. That has been considered a realm of elite decision making. This we've got to change. So this commons rent under an income, if it's not earned, it's socially generated from nature and from people using nature. This can be collected for public benefit from these domains. So land sites, according to land values, the oil, minerals, and other natural resources, land used for timber grazing, mining, ocean and freshwater resources, emissions into air, water, or soil, pollution taxes, sometimes called Pigovian taxes, electromagnetic spectrum and satellite orbital zones. Those are these common rents domains again. So now we can look at these domains as local to global public finance tiers in terms of what is collected from where for whom. So a local tier, very, very fundamental. Surface land values such as sites for homes, business, and industrial activities are well suited to finance public goods and services of cities and towns. But we're looking in our research that there's quite a bit of surface land in our towns and cities that are vacant, that have boarded up buildings. These are going to have a heavier tax because these need to be put for good use. The surface land used for homes, business, and industrial activities, if they're well utilized, will not see a heavier tax penalty. So in rural areas, surface land value tax has potential for non-coercive land reform, for affordable land for regenerative organic agriculture, and revitalize rural culture. Further on, we're going to be going into specific examples of these. I'm just wanting to lay out these tiers. Regional tier, regional state, or in some cases with smaller nations, national government institutions may be tasked to collect user and lease fees from the commons used for oil and mineral extraction, forest and water resources, all the domains that are now generating significant private profit. Global level, a global resource agency is needed to collect and distribute lease fees for the transnational commons. This would include royalties, fish and minerals from the oceans, The law of the seas was established, was articulated, very well developed, but not implemented. The electromagnetic spectrum, and again, these geostationary orbital zones in space where satellites bounce between pools of the Earth and the Moon. That would be in the domain of a global resource agency. Now, for examples of commons rent from surface land. One place to start is property tax reform, whereby taxes are shifted from what we want more of, like housing and local owned businesses, and on to the value of the land, which is a commons created by nature and the community as a whole. Small steps in this direction have been taken by several towns and cities in the state of Pennsylvania, including Harrisburg, the state capital. We'll have slides with details on Harrisburg upcoming, but it was the second most distressed city in the United States before it started implementing this policy. And there have been many benefits and improvements in that capital city. Allentown, the third largest city in the state. This is very interesting because the citizenry were educated about how this policy would work, and they actually voted for this tax to freeze all other local taxes and only have the shift to the land value tax. Interesting, a few who had disproportionate amounts of land that was underutilized, uh, single level parking lots were one. They launched a campaign to have the citizens vote this out. They had media ads, they had airplanes flying with banners. So the citizenry voted for this tax shift a second time. We can vote in this Earth rights democracy. So Pittsburgh, the state's second largest city, had this tax shift to the land values for quite a number of years. It consistently had more affordable housing than other localities. There was an infill development for uses of the city land. But what happens is, now here's what we want to look out for. Pittsburgh lost the plot because often when the cities establish the policy, there's a new city council, there's a new mayor, and they don't understand how well this works. And Pittsburgh had a reassessment of the property, and they had not assessed for quite a while. So the land values and the assessment increased quite a lot, and people's taxes were going to go up quite a bit. All they needed to do was lower the percentage of the tax to have this continue to work. But the city council by that time didn't understand the policy, and they decided to go back to the old system. So now we get to see how Pittsburgh doesn't have the number of affordable housing and other amenities that they had previously. So it's kind of an interesting experiment here, but it does indicate that we need people as a whole to really understand how this works. So another example of land lease public finance is the city-state of Singapore. Land lease of public land and community land trust can address the homeless crisis. So Singapore's land is publicly owned, and they charge lease fees for the land use. So this is a commons rent system. I've never been to Singapore, but I've looked at videos of people who have. It has a lot of beautiful parks and in green space. It has environmental balance with the built environment. If there's any place else in the world of the 40 or so countries I've visited, I think I'd really like to see Singapore. A powerful land reform in California was a result of the RIGHT Act that enabled local districts to issue bonds to pay for irrigation infrastructure. Well, you put in irrigation, it's going to increase the land value. The bonds were then paid off by a land value tax. So the increase in the land value created by this public infrastructure of irrigation was captured, and that then paid for those improvements. And that was expanding to the communities in the area to pay for libraries, education, other kinds of needed infrastructure. 1 million acres of land owned by just one rancher was broken into over 7,000 small farms and healthy communities that formed around the small farm area. Now, what happened? This movement was thwarted by big banks who wanted to have the first debt lien on the land instead of the local community. That meant that if you didn't pay your mortgage to the bank, they could take your land. The Right Act was established so that if for whatever reason you weren't paying your land value tax, your land reverted to the community. So the community had the first lien, not the bank. The banks didn't like this. They took it to the Supreme Court till they won, and it totally reversed the ability for these local irrigation systems to function. And hence we have federal tax dollars subsidizing big agribusiness for irrigation infrastructure. So again, we have to understand how this works to keep it in place. And we need to have these public banks combined with the land value tax, ideally. Now, back to some details on Harrisburg, generally considered a good place to live, praised for its affordability, strong job market, especially in government, healthcare, education, quality of life, convenient location, offers an urban suburban mix with diverse neighborhoods and access to nature. Noted for affordable housing, lower cost of living compared to many East Coast cities of the United States, with amenities like restaurants, parks, cultural activities, making it appealing for families, professionals, and retirees. But this was not always the story. In the 1970s, Harrisburg was declared the second worst city in the United States, second most distressed by federal distressed city criteria. It was a wreck. It had high homeless. It was a dangerous city. The city council was desperate to turn Harrisburg around. They started implementing this very important property tax reform, taking taxes off the housing and onto the land value. They increased the tax split so that 6 times more property tax came onto land value rather than housing. What happened? The effect of this tax policy, noticeable since 1982, described by former Mayor Stephen Reed, up to 2010, $4.8 billion worth of investments occurred. Taxable properties went from $212 million to $1.6 billion. Residential units sharply increased. The vacant structures fell by 80%. There were about 4,000. This is a city of about 50,000 people. There were 4,000 boarded up buildings. It went down in just a short period of time to around 400 or less. So this vacant structures rate fell by 80%. The crime rate dropped by 28%. Thousands of new jobs were created, and Harrisburg began winning a number of city awards. So this was just with a relatively small reform of the local property tax, which was then promoted to bring investments for the revitalization of the city. They did a lot of things right, but this tax shift to the land value, to the commons rent, was a key policy. Now we're going to look at a regional and state resource authorities for, again, commons rent. Constitution of the state of Alaska declares that the mineral resources of Alaska belong to the citizens of the state on an equal basis. So it has a commons rent constitution. So what to do with this commons rent that was going to be coming into the state as the companies began to utilize the oil and other resources of Alaska. So they established the Alaska Permanent Fund, which issues an annual direct citizen dividend checks from the oil rent to each person, including children. And all you do is need to reside in the state for at least 1 year. Now go to this website, pfd.alaska.gov, and you will be able to see how much dividend payment, how many, in October, they issue a check. It has sometimes been as high as nearly $3,000. Now, let's just say it's $2,000 some years. This is the check that indicates the proportion, equal proportion of the land, of the oil rent for each resident of Alaska. So you take a family of four, it's $2,000 per person. A check in October, that's $8,000. That is significant income for a family. And is it unearned? Did they earn it? No. This is an unearned income that otherwise would be privatized. This represents their share of the commons. So please pay attention to the Alaska Permanent Fund. We need these funds everywhere. The Delaware River Basin Commission. It's a breakthrough in water resource management, formed in 1961 when President Kennedy and the governors of Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York signed concurrent compact legislation into law, creating this regional body with the force of law to oversee a unified approach to managing a river system without regard to political boundaries. So all sorts of resources now distributed among different state or national boundaries can be managed and shared through these resource commissions, and that's the model. A commons rent public finance, a way to resolve resource wars and conflicts. For an earth rights policy proposal, see Israel-Palestine cutting the Gordian knot. In this, I go into how that region. Now, these are little states, Israel, Palestine. They're like, well, Palestine is so much smaller now, but like the size of Connecticut or Massachusetts. Uh, really, confederations that share the land and resources. We know that Israel has pretty extreme wealth inequality, even within Israel. So we need to address the land problem no matter what the political boundaries are. So this article, Israel-Palestine Cutting the Gordian Knot, looks at details on how the surface land, the river water, and even the sacred sites would be fairly shared. But here's the next sentence. Here's the caveat. Earth-sharing policies build an economics for a peaceful planet. But of course, we must agree that we are all human beings having an equal right to exist. Voila, how fundamental. We are all human beings. We bleed when we're cut. We cry when we're sad. We laugh when we're happy. Let's acknowledge we are all human beings and share our wondrous planet. Now, look at this as a different kind of image, but now three slides that are going to go into a really powerful information technology that's going to help us implement the commons rent policies. We're going to be able, and we map out the value of the land and resources. This shows land values in the United States. The dark red is the highest land value. The highest land value is where there's the greatest population density and where we need the most funding for infrastructure, for education, for all the things that can make our cities harmonious and worth living in, where there's no homelessness and no gross wealth inequality, and where there's affordable housing for all. Absolutely, with the tax shift, which again is primarily going to be a cities and urban based tax. That's where the people are. That's where the high land values are. Now, this map, and look at how it's going back and forth. It's kind of weird looking, but again, it's tracking in the red the high land values. You see the LA area, you see that Boston to Washington, D.C. area, and other urban areas. Now, what it's showing is if you saw the map just based on land values, it would pretty much be the entire map. The urban areas are where the high land values are. And this is where we work to implement the tax shift and to build our local-based communities, make them healthy, wholesome, good places to live. We want to build our local-based economies. And this is where we've got to look for it. Now, this one, colonialism, these are land value maps and the land value taxation. This is a link to a webinar that looks at this issue, and we've been exploring this issue of land and resource grabbing which we all know of as colonialism. But what we see is there is an internal colonialism in our cities in the United States, whereby those living in the poorest communities, which have the highest proportion of renters, about two-thirds in the poor communities, two-thirds of the people are renters. They are paying their rent to people and companies outside of their community, to people who live in wealthy neighborhoods. And this is, we can see this as internal colonialism, as wealth extraction of these commons rents from the localities to the wealthy owners of land. We have now Martin Luther King Jr. He viewed the American ghetto as a domestic colony. He defined it as a system of internal exploitation and racial injustice. He argued that this system paralleling international colonialism required a radical redistribution of political and economic power to break cycles of poverty, racism, and militarism. He called this the three evils framework. Please go to his speech on this on Black Agenda Report. King argued that racism, economic exploitation, and militarism were interconnected, making it impossible to fix one without addressing the others. We need to connect a lot of dots here. We need peace movements that understand this economics of peace so that they can see the connection from war to poverty to what is happening with homelessness and housing issues in the places where they live. To know that working for an economics of peace and justice in their very own towns and cities and communities is at the same time working for peace on earth everywhere. The earth is our birthright. Equal rights as the birthright to our planet itself. Just as a mother nurtures her child, the earth nurtures all of us, is our Mother Earth. There's enough for everyone. When we acknowledge that we all have a right to exist and that existence itself depends on our rights to the land and resources of our planet, to the gifts of the Creator. You're welcome to join our Earth Rights movement. Link into our international movement at the IU.org. That's the International Union for Land Value Taxation. We can plug you in with people from many, many other countries who are working for this policy. You can join up with them. Our United States, we have several organizations in the US, but Common Ground USA has a particular focus on implementation. There are several regional chapters. You can join up with a chapter, Common Ground USA, which now has a speakers bureau. About 12 of us on the speakers bureau. Go there, see which speakers you might want to invite to give a Zoom presentation or interact with you in some way. Let's start educating more and more people. Then The Earth Belongs to Everyone is the book that I wrote, received a Radical Middle Award. It has 30 articles and essays relevant to this Economics of War and Peace series. And the last one is a narrative around the charts we've been presenting in this webinar. So it's available on Amazon, but there's a free PDF at the IU.org books. So I leave you with the final thought. The earth belongs to everyone. Equal rights to our planet as a birthright. Earth rights democracy. There you have it, the last slide in our series of 5, Regis. 5 webinars on economics of war and peace.
Okay, stop sharing the screen and you and I can have a conversation.
Great. Okay.
There. I want to thank you for that. It's a wonderful presentation. On the one hand, I'm an optimist and an idealist, um, which is why I have wanted to explore with you these last number of shows, because I believe in it. I'm hopeful. But on the other side, I'm a realist. And I see some significant problems with implementing uh, the goals of um, this movement. And I want to share them with you. And I would like your opinion. I know that you've used two or three examples in Pennsylvania uh, and other places uh, around the world, but you quickly alluded to the opposition, which comes from the big banks. They're not just national, they're global. These people thrive on debt, on usury. They're not likely to give this up quickly. The other problem, and I only speak about the United States now. I think it's applicable to probably Europe and maybe other places, but just the United States. I see the people in the United States not even having the time or the attention to pay attention to this. I think they're so overwhelmed. I'm talking now the majority of the people in the United States, so overwhelmed with just getting by. They have nothing in savings, so to speak. They go to work, they might, maybe many of the people are working two and three jobs just to stay afloat. They don't have the time that others have had to contemplate the solutions that you have presented, which are very easy to understand, but they don't have the time. I think the other thing, Alanna, is the American people are suffering greatly, but they're not angry enough to resist the injustice. They're not angry enough, and they don't have the understanding that this ballooning national debt, 38 trillion and rising, individual debt is at $18 trillion a year. These people are just being most Americans are just being worn down. The other part of the problem, as I see it, is that it's just like during the Roman era, the Roman era, circuses and bread. You look at all the circuses that are taking place in the United States to distract people.
Huh.
The Super Bowl, all professional sports. There's no lack of people paying tens of thousands of dollars for season tickets. And these stadiums and these arenas are filled. This is a small percentage of the American people, but these people are not willing and not even understanding how unfair and how unjust the whole system is. They're comfortable. So, Alanna, just with these three or four comments that I've mentioned, how do you hope to overcome that?
Thank you, Regis. I took notes on your questions and concerns, and let's keep digging into them. So big banks, they're so huge, they're so powerful. And you say people aren't angry enough, and you're right. Enough people are have a sufficient income that they're able to go to bread and circuses, these big events. But anger is a flip side of hurt, and there's more and more people who are hurting. In fact, in my small town where I live nearby, 20,000 people, on Tuesday, I'm going to some church ministers are organizing an event to say we must deal with this homeless crisis. It's getting really bad. And that mean, and I personally know people, I've met people who are homeless living in vans and so on in my community. It is growing crisis everywhere. People are hurting, and hurt also drives change. Once that hurt is seen, expressed, and shown, and there are compassionate people who want to address these problems, and it's for them to get together outside of these crazy right, left, Democrat, Republican box that divide and conquer has kept the American people stuck in for a long time. People are dropping like flies out of those boxes of Republican, Democrat. They're saying, well, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. And they're desperate to find solutions, and they're desperate to find a leadership that is beyond that old right and old left. And also, I think there's a strengthening that happens when people do feel the hurt and, yes, sometimes the anger. And they then say, I want to do something about it. And they get a little bit of a direction and guidance about a way forward. I believe that there will be more and more people jumping on board because in all communities, there's also agencies, there's social service, there's networks, there's all kind of organizations that that are built because they want to help people. They want to build peace. They don't want these wars. And as the leadership of our local based community organizations come together in local citizen assemblies, which are also happening, call the people together, network, uh, discuss, think things through, look at good ideas. We're going to see more and more as things come into a shambles on our federal United States levels. The crisis is being reflected on the local levels, local people, where the real action is coming together to solve local problems, saying, what are we sending our taxpayer dollars to Washington, D.C.? We need to keep it at home.
Bingo. Let me jump in.
Okay.
I think therein is the problem. That those elected representatives do not represent us at all. I think more and more people are beginning to understand that. These representatives, so-called, have been stealing our money to the tune of trillions of dollars of national debt, to the tune of trillions of dollars that these representatives are funding budgets every 2 years on the War Department, on creating wars all over the world. I think that people need to be informed about how evil and where the evil lies in the system, and that's in the government, in the Congress, in the presidency, in the Supreme Court. They have not served the interest of the people. And I think part of the problem is the peace groups are scattered. There is no unified peace movement. There's no unified anti-war movement. There's no unified movement that is showing how their money is being stolen and wasted on all these wars and not on improving the lives of everyday Americans. I think Americans have somehow got to be informed to get angry and to somehow change that system. You and I both know elections are not going to do it. The other thing,
Go.
the other
There's
thing
a
that
caveat there, though. But I wanted to talk about the caveat to elections aren't going to do it. But I interrupted you, so please complete your thought.
no, well, my thought was to go back to something you said. All politics are local. People at the local level, on the one hand, they have to come together. But the only reason they come together is not to celebrate, is to share the pain, to share the injustice, to share the inequality.
Yes.
And to me, that's the greatest challenge. You've experienced some of that in Pennsylvania. I'm looking at like where I came from in the state of Maine. I have a handful of friends that have been trying to do this, to expose the legislature and how they're totally corrupted by the military industrial complex. The investments in the state of Maine, okay, by Bath Iron Works, General Electric, and a host of other military industrial complex, Alanna, that provides jobs. When I was living there for years, I was documenting the protest. I was documenting the education campaigns. It didn't make any difference. It didn't change those local elections. The people in power were all bought and paid for, and they all believed that if they did anything to reduce employment in those agencies that were employing thousands of people, they'd be voted out. And so I think this is the state in all 50 of the continental United States where there is a military industrial complex, manufacturing, whatever it is, complex that really does not allow the people to have a voice. I don't know how we overcome that.
Well, understanding the structures of peace and the structures of economic injustice and how wealth inequality grows, I mean, there's always plenty of work to do, but we're talking paid jobs here. So there's a fundamental dysfunctionality in the economy at the local level because there's all kind of housing that's needed. We need to have more organic food grown locally. There's all kinds of work. So again, it's get and understand how our tax dollars are putting us into this kind of abject slavery and war situation and how we can actually reverse it. When people understand this, and there are examples where the town council has been understanding it and the good, we have good elected leaders everywhere. We have to highlight the good leaders. I pretty much given up on reform on the federal level. I ran for Congress twice. I didn't have enough money to win. It's all about money. The person that won was having money in his campaign fund from people coming that didn't even live in our congressional district, that were corporations from outside the district because he was the head of the transportation committee that had a lot of funding. He is going to stay in because he's serving those interests. So we have to see that. Don't allow money to come in from outside your congressional district. Just we do need to have some voting reforms, but locally you can go into that office of that mayor and that town council. You can stand in the office with them. You can show up at a public forum with them. You can eyeball them and talk to them. That is where that's where the power is. The superpower of the people is located where the people live on the ground, standing on Mother Earth, understanding that we want to serve the benefit of all people. And we want outside this right left box, we want a fairness and freedom. We don't want to say we need big government to have social dividends, we need small government to have a market. No, we need right sized government that's going to keep the balance so that we have a fair distribution of wealth and also freedom of the individual and families to create wealth, fair free markets, I call it. So because we now have the information technology can chart out when you make this tax shift locally, who pays more and who pays less. Now, I mentioned Pittsburgh. There was a company in Pittsburgh. They had an industry in one location. They had boarded up buildings along a nice riverfront in the other location. They were going to pay more with a tax shift on their boarded up buildings, and they were going to do just fine and pay maybe even less where they were utilizing the land well, creating the goods and employing people. So this is not an anti-corporate, anti-business approach whatsoever. It's an anti-good and fair land use methodology. It's not attacking anyone. It's saying let's tax the bad things like land speculation and land profiteering and land hoarding. Those individuals and companies should pay more to our community. They're not using our land in the way that we need them to. But you're providing goods and services. You're fixing up the housing stock, which all generates good local businesses and employment, by the way. That's what we want more of. We're not going to tax the good things. We're going to tax the bad things, which will then fund for the good things that we need as public goods and services. So while we can do a deep dive to go into the law of rent and all these things we've been doing in this series, I believe that a few people that start to understand this, and then the ability to articulate it, and also again to go to able to see who pays more and who pays less when you do this local tax shift, you will find that the majority are going to pay less because the taxes are too much on people's housings and on the buildings. So actually, the majority taxpayers pay less because we're taking the taxes off of their local income taxes, local sales taxes. We're removing the tax burden on the good things, on wages. And then we start seeing, oh, it starts working locally. Well, then we can start asking, well, why are we taking so much of our tax dollars into Washington, D.C., that's doing bad things with our tax money, like subsidizing corporations and waging wars? Maybe we shouldn't be paying that income tax to the federal government. So again, we need a local based economy. We need to decentralize from Washington, D.C., too much power and money, not to mention traffic congestion, going into that one tiny spot on Earth. So I will say that there are predictions, and it's hard to believe now whether or not the U.S. will break apart like the Soviet Union did, but it's certainly going to be decentralizing into more regional and local governance. This center is so corrupt, it cannot hold. It is naturally falling apart, and the corruption is being revealed as we speak. So while there are movements that say we don't want this, we don't want that, we need the proactive movements. People are out in the streets. Massive people are coming out in the streets now for various things, but they're not clear about what they want. They don't know what to say yes to. So I've been putting together a 10-point plan for building local based economies. I can share more of that another time, perhaps. But this very clear and beautiful 10-point plan for building our local based economies that can inspire people to really engage in their localities and to not just keep paying for big football games and big superstars performing at a high ticket price, but to see that in their own locality they can have, there's so much talent right around where people live that doesn't have that corporate entertainment dollar to boost them to superstar status. They can start appreciating the people where they live. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
I don't
excuse me.
disagree with any of this. I mean, I've invested quite a bit of time in reading your book and in doing these shows with you in the
Yeah,
hopes that we could educate a very few people. I don't have a big following. You know, those people with the big followings are talking about geopolitical events. They're talking about the war in Ukraine. What is Russia doing? What is Ukraine doing? What's going on with the EU? And it's all a bunch of bullshit. It's a big distraction from what is really going on, what is distracting people. Distracting is the word that I'm using from what is really happening in their daily lives. And people are overwhelmed. That was my point. There's people that are in depression. There's people that they can't spend the time listening to you and me and what we're trying to talk about because they're just trying to survive. And you mentioned something just recently in your last few comments. Um, the way I interpret it, I think the system in the United States is doomed. It's headed for a collapse that I believe it will be worse than the collapse of the Soviet Union. And why do I say that? Because the people during the Soviet era were stronger. They were self-reliant. They were self-sustaining. They could grow food. They weren't going to the supermarkets. And the American people have grown soft. The American people will not be able to survive when there's no food in the supermarkets. And as I look at this, and I'm hopeful, I would not have spent this time sharing all of this with you if I didn't think that there was a better future. But on the realistic side, the objective side, I see the system collapsing because not only is it not sustainable, I believe that it's evil. When you have such wealth and such power concentrated in the hands of so few who abuse it and who do not spend their time, their energy, and their money, and I'm talking about our elected officials, on the good and the benefit of the American people, you've got a system that I don't believe can be reformed. I believe it needs to collapse.
Well, as it collapses, we need to show the reforms, though. It's not first it collapses and everybody's hungry and killing each other, and then we figure out what to do next. So, what we need to do is to get enough visionary leadership out there to say, hey, here's the way to go because this is falling down. Build this. If you're hungry enough, if you've got a backyard, you're going to grow food. But that's the point. People in the cities don't have access, but even in the cities, there's growing agriculture, little plots being used to grow food. There's little food cooperatives happening in the crevices of the vacant lots and so on, or the rooftops in our cities. I recently joined up with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the oldest women's peace organization established in 1915, by the way, by Jane Addams, who was an admirer of Henry George economics. And they're in 30 countries now, 30 countries. I was on a wonderful call with 50 very strong women that really want a peaceful world. And they have a good plan based on Martin Luther King's work for the city of Philadelphia, where the headquarters are. A really good plan for building local-based community. So there's a peace group. It's looking at the money problem. It has a plan for a local-based community for Philadelphia. I think that's where we're going to see these networks of peace groups take off. We're also seeing like one of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom leaders establish the chapter for combatants for peace in the Philadelphia area. Those are former Israeli IDF soldiers who are now for peace. Okay, the combatants for peace. We have veterans for peace organizations. I believe that these military people who are saying these wars are wrong, I'm not going to kill other people, these wars have got to be stopped. These courageous military people who have been misled as to what they're fighting for, but have you awakened. I believe that those people coming together with this new vision is going to be a very, very powerful force. So if we're having a blockage in some kind of obstinate bureaucrat or something, or some tax reform law that we want passed, and there's a city council people who are obstructing it, I just want to see the people standing with the military people who are disgusted with war. I want the military people for peace to come out with their uniforms as a show of nonviolent peace force with the citizenry to simply show that we, the power of the people, must prevail. Regis, there is that phrase, we are the many, they are the few. And we're at that point where the few have become so vicious and powerful that it has to switch. It collapses. The question is, and I think that's what we're asking, is it going to be how much violence for the shift to happen? How much breakdown? Is there going to be civil war type of things? It depends on the enlightened action and leadership of the moral, values-oriented people getting a clear vision of the way forward that can unite people beyond these divisions.
Yeah, and
So that is where I'm headed. That's where I'm headed. I'm headed
yeah.
to building these strong local coalitions.
Well, and that's one of the things that's lacking. Everybody's looking for a leader, and there isn't anybody, in my opinion, on the horizon in the United States or Europe who is a visionary, who can inspire people with these ideas. I've been involved in the peace movement for a long time. I was an associate member of the Veterans for Peace. I'm not a veteran. Two of my boys served in the United States military, and I've worked very hard, and all of my work as a filmmaker to expose the real true history of the United States in terms of colonialism, world domination, hegemony. And I feel badly that the peace movement is so disjuncted and not united, and therefore not effective. The other thing that I want to say that I believe is very important. I have some friends in the state of Maine who have been protesting against Bath Iron Works, where they manufacture Aegis destroyers, and the classic failure of the Zumwalt, three of them costing several $billions apiece, that they couldn't even get out of the Kennebec River into the ocean without whatever it was breaking down. They had to be towed back. And what my friends have been trying to do, in addition to protesting several times a week for several years with their signs on the street corners, what they have tried to point out is that if the military industrial complex was converted to peacetime use, it would generate more jobs for people, jobs that would improve the infrastructure, jobs that would return manufacturing to the United States. Like, Trump is such a freaking idiot. He thinks by tariffs and sanctions, he's going to encourage companies from Germany and other places to come to the United States and reestablish a cultural base. Where I'm going with this is, my friends have tried to impress upon people how much their own money is being stolen from them and redirected to things that do not improve their lives and do not improve the United States. And I think until all of these peace groups, all of these other groups that envision a better future, until they can show the American people how their government has been stealing their money, not for their own benefit, but for their own power and for the purpose of war, which fills the pockets of the big banks. And Alanna, I've been saying this for a long time. There's millions of people in the United States that have invested in these military companies, industrial complex, who have been getting wealthy. They have blood on their hands. They need to be exposed. The American people need to understand how this injustice, and how it's built into the system is what is causing all of their misery. In my opinion, that has to happen. I know, and I believe in what you're trying to do. I would not have spent this time with you to do it. I believe what you're talking about is right and just, but I think people need to become aware of how their tax dollars have been misused by the people that they continue to elect every 2 and every 4 years.
Okay, well, we're taking it down to taxes again, aren't we? I mean, the American Revolution was a tax on tea, the Boston Tea Party. It often comes down to unfair and inequitable taxes. Now, back to Maine. 1% of the population owns 2/3 of the land in Maine. You have massive timber companies in Maine cutting down the trees, paying almost no resource rent to the people. You have, in this pretty low populated big state of Maine, you do have homelessness. You definitely have poverty and affordable housing issues. Um, this is where the connection that King was talking about, racism, poverty, and militarism, they're all connected. I don't see your peace people in Maine connecting the poverty and homelessness issue to their peace issues, Regis. They're not. They need to look right in their towns and cities. They need to say, hey, what's happening with the homeless people and the lack of affordable housing and the wealth inequality where I live? And how does that relate to the bigger goal of stopping the military industrial complex? I'm saying they got to start looking right locally in Maine and in their state, the tax base in their state. They got to look at the social problems in their towns and cities, and they got to connect the dots, Regis. That's what I've been trying to do with this talk, Economics of War and Peace, and it directly connects with what Martin Luther King said. They are all interconnected. You have to address all at once. So I believe that the peace movement in Maine will be strengthened if they connect it to their own state tax dollars, the corporations who own so much of their land, and the social problems where they live. Does
Yeah.
that make sense to you?
Yeah.
There's
And
a
it's,
little bit of dot connecting that we need to do there with your peace friends in Maine.
yeah, well, it's not just the state of Maine, it's every other state in the country.
Absolutely. I was just
Yeah.
using that because that's where you were from.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's every place, everywhere.
Well,
Yeah,
Alanna,
absolutely.
I want to thank you so much for the time that you've invested in this, not just for these 4 or 5 shows, but the last whatever it is, 25 years of your life. Uh,
50.
yeah. So we'll be in touch, and it's not the last time that we're going to revisit this.
Wonderful, Regis. Thank you. Thank you so much for your life work as well. All those documentaries and films and all those great works you've done for your whole life. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me all these several sessions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alanna. We'll be back in touch.